Hi good people, Titus here for part 16 of our Asteroids mini-series, and in this video, we'll work on setting up the high score screen widget so our player can input their initials and capture their score. Let's not waste any time and jump right into it. Alright, I think starting off we're going to go into our widgets folder, and we will create the widget that captures the player's input for their initials first. So we'll right click, create a new user interface, and choose widget blueprint. You can then just select user widget, and we'll call this WBP underscore input, or maybe initials. Double click, and then we can dock that into the main window. I'm going to start off by adding a canvas panel. And then I think I'm going to add a simple image. I can come to my anchors and select full screen. I can then go back to anchors, hold Control, and click full screen. And it'll stretch out the image. Come to the color and opacity, and I'm going to maybe swap it to a black instead of a white. And then I'm going to come into my input. And you have a few different input options. I think the one that works probably the best for this is going to be the editable text. You can just drag that in. You select anchors. I'm going to choose center. I'm going to go back and hold Control and choose center. I'm going to go back and hold Shift and choose center. And then for the hint text, I'll maybe put in something like enter your initials and press enter. And then if I choose size to content and check that box, it'll kind of space it out there. We can then mess with the font. Let's maybe keep it similar to our other widgets. We're using that pixel font that I got from the internet. And then we'll just make it a little bit bigger so it's easier to see. Now the editable text box has a couple different options for it. If you scroll down to the bottom, I think it has two main events. It has an on-text changed event and a on-text committed event. Committed is basically when the player pushes enter. We're actually going to be using both of these. So we're going to hit the plus sign, and then I'm going to go back to designer view, scroll down, and hit the plus sign on the text committed. So I'll get both items here. The reason we want both is because we're going to be using a substring method, which is basically the player is going to be able to type in anything, but we really only want to capture like the first 3 characters, honestly, and then we want to get rid of the rest. So anytime the text is changed, we can run that substring function and just have it cut the string down. And then the on text committed, we need this because after the player's done entering the initials and they press enter, we want it to actually run some other function, basically call the other widgets or run some code, that sort of thing. And I think to store the text or the string, we'll probably throw that in our game manager. I think that makes the most sense. So on the event pre-construct, we can probably come off this into a cast to BP game manager, and we can pull off the object into a get game mode, and then we can simply right click and promote this to a variable. Call this our game manager reference. That way we just have it and can use it. Now, I don't think we're going to be using tick for anything. We might use construct, so we might leave that for now. But we'll bring it up there so it's kind of out of the way. Now, for the on-text change, we can just simply right-click, and there's a function called getSubstring. Substring, if you ever worked with anything in automation, you're probably very familiar with this. It's great. Essentially, think of it like subtracted string. You tell the function to start at a particular location, 0 being at the beginning of the string, or 1, 2, 3, 4 is 1, 2, 3, or 4 characters into the text string. And then you can tell how long you want it to be from that point. We want ours to be 3 characters for this example. And then what it'll do is it'll subtract or cut the rest of the string. So it only gives you the value that you kind of need. And we can take the text output and plug this into the source. It'll automatically do the conversion for us. And then what we want is this editable text variable, which we go back to the designer view. Editable texts automatically come in as variables, so that's where that's coming from, in case you're curious. So it's just going to be this name right here. You can just basically come into, oops, did I rename that? I didn't mean to if I did. Editable text 0, no, it should be good. Okay. All right, anyways. We can drag the editable text out, and we'll drag into a set text. And then we can just return the value into the text field. It'll reconvert it into from a string to text. And we can hook up the execution pins like so. And that's going to be basically the only code we need for the on text change. And this is all this is doing is keeping the input 3 characters. So the player won't be able to input, you know, like the alphabet for their initials, for example. For the on text committed, this is going to be what happens when the player presses enter. So there's going to be a few things we're going to want to do there. We're going to want to pass in the text to the game manager. So let's actually open up our blueprints folder, and we will find and open the game manager. And we're going to want to create another variable and another event. So I think the variable, we'll call it, we'll just call it my string, make it simple, or my initials, whatever you want to name it. And then the type, I'm going to set it to a string value. And then for the event, we can just right click, add custom event. And then we can probably just call this capture initials, whatever you want to name it. And this function should have one input, and the input will be the initials, and that is of course going to be a string. And then all we do is we can just hold Alt, drag the my string in, hook up the execution pin and the input pin as so, and that'll set the variable my string to whatever we pass in from whatever calls this function, which we're going to be calling it from the widget. So that should be good for now. So let's go back to the widget. Now we made a call to the game manager already. We did in the pre-construction, you can see that here. We cast the game manager, which is this thing here, and then we stored it as a variable. So because of that, we can grab that variable, hold Control, drag it in, and then off the game manager, you can call in that custom event that we made, which was just called capture initials. So if we drag off this, search for capture initials, there it is. You can pass the text into the string value. It'll automatically make the conversion for you. Now normally you just hook up the execution pins, but for this I've noticed that depending on the keyboard you have, like I have a very sensitive keyboard, the player can push enter and it registers multiple hits depending on, I guess, what kind of keyboard you're using. So to prevent that from being basically overriding the variable, which in most cases won't be an issue, but for what we're doing for this method later on, we're going to be using this to add to an array. So that's basically going to add more methods to the array, so it will be an issue. We're going to call a control node called do once, because we're effectively only going to be doing this once anyways. So let's just put that in between the pins here. That way it doesn't actually cause any issues. After we pass the string input, basically the initials, to the game manager, it'll store it into this variable here, and then we're good with this widget. So we don't need this widget anymore. So what we can do is we can tell it to create widget, And we got to figure out the widget that we need to create. But after that, you'll tell to add to viewport, and then you can call into the remove from parent. The remove from parent will basically get rid of or remove this widget, so you don't have them overlapping. So now all we have to do is figure out what new widget we want to make. And we can't compile it yet, but let's go into our widgets folder. We'll right click, create a new user interface. It'll be a widget blueprint. And then we'll do another user widget. And we'll just call this WBP underscore high score. And now if we go back to the WBP initials, you can tell it just to call into that high score widget. Compile and save, and that one will work just fine. Now, before we actually start coding the high score widget, we got to make some adjustments to the rest of this project to make this kind of work. So right now, if we go into our game manager, we should capture the initials and the score when the game is over, right? So if we look up here, we have a check on lives. If lives is less than 0, it creates the game over widget. So let's take a look at the game over widget and see what that's doing. So the game over widget plays the animation of this widget, and then it waits 8 seconds, and then it reopens level 1. So instead of reopening level 1, let's delete that, and we will instead create widget, and we're going to tell it to create the initials widget to capture the player's initials, basically. And then pretty much it's going to be very similar to what we were doing before, where you're adding it to the viewport, and then you have to remove it from parent. Removing it from parent basically removes the game over widget, so it removes this widget, so it's not viewable anymore. And then normally this would be it, but there is another thing we have to do here. We need to set the controller mode. Typically with Unreal Engine, when you're playing the game, at least on the default projects, you're playing in what's known as game mode only, but we need it to be in a UI mode. So if you drag off this pin, you can actually tell it to set input mode, and you'll see you have UI, you have game only, and then you have game and UI. We can actually just do game and UI, and that'll work just fine. You can also get away with just doing UI. Because we're technically going to be using the keyboard, and we're going to be using the mouse. So for the widget to focus, you can tell it on the create widget. You can drag that blue pin in over here. And I'm just going to double click to add a reroute node. And then the rest of these defaults are actually going to be just fine. We do need a player controller, so you can drag off this and tell get player controller. And then player index 0 is player 1. The other thing we'll want to do is to show the mouse cursor, so the player can see where to click. So you can drag off this pin here, set show mouse cursor, and then I'm going to do another reroute node right here, and then we'll just set this to true. And this is basically the code that we're going to be adding to the game over widget. So pretty straightforward. So calls game over, plays our game over animation, waits 8 seconds, then it creates the initials widget, it adds it to the viewport, removes the game over, and then it sets the input mode to be able to capture keyboard and mouse movement so the player can see what they're clicking and doing. And then it basically will pass over to the initials widget. That makes a cast to the game manager. It'll substring the text field to be only 3 characters. Once the player pushes enter, it'll do this function once. It'll go and reference the game manager and tell it to run the event capture initials. and it's going to pass the text that the player put in to this event. This event is basically the one we just made down here. It's very simple. It just passes that information along to a variable we created called myString, and that is just a string type variable. After that, it's going to create another widget called highScore, add it to the viewport, and then it's going to basically delete or remove the initials widget. So this one right here. So pretty straightforward. Now, because we're messing with the UI, the input mode, we'll want to set that back in the level 1 or in the main menu. You can do it from any place really. Since we have level 1 open, I think that'll work just fine. We can just essentially go up here, open the level blueprint, and then we have an event begin play node where we're setting the spawn locations of these spawn points for the rock spawners. At the end of that, you can just essentially just call into the same node, well, similar node, set input mode, but we'll flip it back to game only. And then for the player controller, you can of course just pull that off, get player controller, and then use the index of 0 for player 1. And then the other thing we do is set show mouse cursor. This time we're going to leave it to false. That way it's more like what it has been. This effectively just makes it so when the player's moving around and shooting asteroids, you don't see their mouse. Like the mouse isn't moving off screen. The reason that can be an issue is because we're using the mouse to handle rotation, so the player will move left and right and they might keep drifting left, so the mouse is going to go off the screen, so it can be an issue. But yeah. So now we can go back into, oops, I'll go ahead and compile. We can go back into our widgets and let's actually open up the highScore widget and let's begin kind of creating this. So just like before, I think we'll add a canvas panel. And this time I think maybe I'll do a vertical box. And then I'm going to anchor this full screen. I'm going to go back, hold control, and that'll flip it kind of like that. Once I have my vertical box, I'm going to add a text box, but I'm going to add the text inside the vertical box, so it's a child. And then I can select that text, and then I'm going to set this to justify center. And then for the text, I'll call it highScore. And for the font, I'm going to use that pixel font I downloaded, make it pretty decently sized. I'm going to go into the outline settings. I'm going to add an outline of 8, just to get a little bit of contrast there, and I think that looks just fine. Then maybe I'll add a horizontal box. This time I'm going to add this one to the vertical box, so it's a child of the vertical box basically. And then inside the horizontal box, let's add a text. And this text is going to be initials _ 0, and this will be a variable. Justified center. Actually, I think with the horizontal box, you want to justify that center, and then this one doesn't actually matter. Yeah, that one can be whatever actually, because it'll just follow the horizontal box. And then for the actual text, I think I'll just do 3 dashes. I'm going to use the same pixel font, make it a little bit bigger. And then for the outline, I'll use 8. So there's a little bit of contrast. And I think that looks fine. So from here, I'm going to add maybe a spacer. Add that to the horizontal box. And then after the spacer, I will add a text. Oops. And for the text, I'm going to use just a semicolon and a space. And I want this to be kind of the same as this. So we used 128 pixel font. So let's do 128 and pixel font with an outline of 8. If I click up here, I think that looks all right. Now I need to create another text element after it, but I'm just going to right click on the initials and duplicate it, drag it below so it's the last item here. And instead of initials, we'll call this score_0. And the text I'll just change to be 0. So you can see my basic layout, I'll have the initials on the left, semicolon, and then I'll actually have the score. Now just for demonstrations, we can just collapse that, right click, duplicate it. And then I just need to change a little bit around of these variable names. So I'll do a _1. And for the score, _1. And then I can right click, duplicate that. And this will be _2. And this will be _2. And I think that's probably good for at least the design of the widget anyways. It's nothing too crazy. We'll be able to store the initials, the score, and then we'll just kind of keep writing it down. And you can make this as, you know, how many entries you want or whatever you're doing for your prototype. But let's go into the graph view after we compile. For the pre-construct, we're going to do what we did before. We'll cast to the game manager. Pull off the object pin into get game mode. And we can right click, promote it to a variable, game manager reference. And then that's all good there. Now on the actual construction, I don't think we'll need tick for anything. What you can do is we can basically, just for demonstrating this, that this will actually work, we're going to change this code to be using arrays probably in the next video. But we're kind of running short on time, I think. This video is a little bit too long as it is. Let's just drag the initials and the score. So we'll just do one little go at this. We pull into a set text. And I can just duplicate that over here. Hook up the execution pins like so. We can get our game manager reference. Get score. And then get my string. And then we can just feed the score in here. Oops. And feed the string in here. So remember, the game manager is actually what's capturing all the info, right? So we have the string there. And then in an earlier video, we created a score variable, which is capturing the score. So this should be the majority of the code that we need to actually run this and test this out. What we can do is come into a delay. Let's wait maybe 8 seconds. And then we can tell it to open level by name. And we'll do main menu. Now to test this, I'm going to go into my game manager. And normally for our lives, we have 3 lives. I'm actually just going to set this to 1 to make this easy for testing. And let's see what happens. We got 1 life. We can see that's working. And maybe we get a little bit of score here. All right, it wipes me out. I should get the game over. should fade to black after the animation plays. Then it should go into the initials widget that we created. And then I have my mouse. So I can click in here and we can add, whatever you want. Now you notice I can't add any more text. So the substring method is working. If I push enter, it stores that string as a variable, and it captured my score, and it updates the high score screen. After 8 seconds, it should load the main menu. And it looks like that's working. And then we're back in our main menu prototype. If I push spacebar, I should be back in the game, where I can actually move around and continue to play. Alright, good people, I think we'll cut it here to keep it somewhat short, but in the next one, we'll cover how to save and load game data so our player's high score will persist when we close the project. As always, thanks for watching, consider subscribing, and see you on the next one.